This is the book Winchee, Mission Stories of Colin and Melva Winch by S Ross Goldstone. The true adventures of missionary pilots and nurses in the South Pacific, as retold to the children of Watertown SDA Church. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go! This chapter is called The Passion is Born. Doug Ling, Ellis Gibbons, and Colin Winch were bored. Off duty, they sat in Colin's room in the nurse's residence at the Sydney Sanitarium and Hospital, wondering what they could do. "Why don't we build an aeroplane?" said Colin. "A plane?" the others responded. "We don't know anything about planes. You mean a model plane?" "No, a real plane that flies." So the idea was tossed around, and finally they agreed. They would build an aeroplane. Since they knew nothing about building aeroplanes, they decided to visit the New South Wales State Library and find material on the task ahead. So Doug and Colin made the trip into Sydney and found their way to the library with its shelves stacked with books. Never had they seen so many books. They peered through the glass doors, drawing the attention of a bespectacled lady seated at the desk. Opening the doors, the boys went to speak to her. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "We're wanting to find a book on how to build an aeroplane," replied Colin, the designated spokesman. Directing the two trainee nurses to the card system, the librarian suggested that they look up aeronautics. After a process of searching, they located some books and began to read them, but the technical nature of the information made no sense to them. Finally, Doug said, "Why don't we just measure the wingspan in comparison to the body, and then it'll be okay?" So that's what they took back to Warunga. No books, only measurements of the wings. Ellis was the owner of a bandsaw located below the dormitory. Doug was skilled at wood carving, so he was responsible for creating the wings, and Colin was given the task of obtaining the timber. Colin drove to a timber mill on the outskirts of the Sydney suburb of Hornsby. Speaking to the foreman, he asked about the availability of seasoned, light but cheap timber. "What do you need it for?" asked the foreman. At first reluctant to reveal their purpose, Colin finally revealed it was for the construction of an aeroplane. The foreman shook his head in disbelief. "There's a heap of old timber down the back," he said. "Help yourself." So Colin returned with links of timber hanging out the windows of his old Chrysler car. "We have the timber," he announced to his co-builders. "Now we have to obtain some sort of fabric to cover the wings." So another visit to Hornsby resulted in a free bolt of water-damaged cotton fabric, sufficient to clad the wooden framework. None of the builders had ever been near a plane to see the internal workings of an aeroplane, so the end result was primitive, particularly when Doug decided to shorten the wingspan in comparison to the size of the body. The fuselage was made just wide enough to house Colin's slender frame. News of their venture had spread through the hospital, resulting in the young male nurses getting a good deal of teasing from their female associates. "It'll never get off the ground," they taunted. "You wait and see," responded a confident Colin. "Soon we'll be circling around and you'll be there waving to us." Of course, the plane had to have an undercarriage with wheels, but even this problem was quickly solved. There was a baby carriage lying under the old wooden hospital building. This was commandeered and put to good use. Eventually the time came for the maiden flight. One Sunday morning, the fuselage was loaded onto the back of a small truck and transported to Turramurra Park. To reach the park, they had to drive past the local Catholic church, where worshippers were attending morning mass. Their curiosity aroused, some of the worshippers followed the vehicle to the park, not wanting to miss out on the excitement. A second trip brought the wings, and then the plane was bolted together. Colin had assumed that he would be the pilot. After all, he'd built the bodywork just wide enough for him to sit in, and besides, he had a driver's license. But Doug had other ideas. "I built the wings, therefore I should have the first flight," he argued. Eventually, they tossed a coin, and Doug won. Then a real problem arose. How was the rather more portly Doug to fit into the space built only to house skinny Colin? With much squeezing and pushing while the Catholic onlookers held the plane in place, Doug was compressed into the pilot's seat. A rope was attached to the front of the plane, with the other end held by Colin, who was then sitting on the back of a truck and signaling the driver to accelerate. A look of fear crossed Doug's face as the plane rumbled its way across the turf. He was heading straight towards brick houses and trees. What would happen if the plane didn't actually take off? "Pull the stick back! Pull the stick back!" shouted Colin in an attempt to achieve liftoff. But in vain. There was not enough lift, and the towing vehicle was heading for a deep ditch, previously unnoticed by the prospective aviators. Sensing the danger, the truck driver swung violently to avoid the obstacle, but the plane held its straight line, coming to rest just inches away from the ditch. With great effort and groans of pain, an effort was made to extricate Doug from the fuselage. They lifted and tugged, but they just lifted the whole plane off the ground. The onlookers ran to give assistance, holding the plane down while the extraction proceeded. It was just like pulling a molar out of a human jaw, without painkillers. Eventually, Doug was freed and it was decided to make a second attempt, this time with Colin as the pilot. The truck driver suggested that a longer runway could be achieved by cutting across the park at a different angle. So the second attempt began, this time with Colin in the plane and Doug on the back of the truck. All was well until they reached a slightly elevated cricket pitch. As the pram wheels hit the small mound, there was a bang, and the undercarriage wheels were ripped off. Then Colin noted the rumbling had ceased, and he was suspended in the air. He was flying! After coming to rest, Colin emerged from the plane. It flew, he enthused. How far off the ground were we? The others confirmed the plane had in fact flown, a full 6 inches above the ground. Assured that flight was possible, the plane was returned to Warunga, where alterations were made. The undercarriage was lowered and strengthened, turning it into an improved glider. Because of a lack of transport, it was decided that the next attempt should be made in one of the cow fields on the hospital farm. George Evans owned an early model Chevy with a seat at the back. When everything was ready, Colin climbed into the now widened pilot's seat at the front of the plane, and George accelerated away, hurtling down the paddock. As they gained speed, they realized the cows had recently been feeding in the field, and wet cow dung was being thrown up from the car wheels all over Colin. Desperately, he called a halt and cleaned the offending manure from his face and hair. Then it was Doug's turn, and he too was covered in fresh cow manure. There was only one thing left to do. Let the plane fly without a pilot. So once more, George hurtled down the paddock in his car, and the plane took off. Round and round the paddock drove George. 15 feet above him, the plane flew in hot pursuit. For its young builders, it was a thing of beauty. Now, it's one thing to fly a plane, but it's another thing to land it. Slow down, George, slowly, called Colin. As George slowed down the car, the plane caught up and threatened to crash into the back of the car. In grave danger, George accelerated away. By this time, Colin was running alongside the vehicle, calling out again, Slow down, George, slowly! Every time George slowed down the car, the plane threatened to crash into the back of the car. So in desperation, he headed for a tree and swerved at the last minute, allowing the plane to end its flight, a crumpled heap of junk, never to fly again. The plane died an ignominious death, but the love of flying was forever implanted in Colin's heart, and soon 2 loves would be linked, a love of flying and a love of mission service. Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book Winchee by S Ross Goldstone, which is available at the Adventist Book Center. And meanwhile, check out these videos and others on my channel, with many more mission stories and Bible skits for kids and adults. God bless you.